Hi, everyone. I'm Tish Conlon. Here's another episode of Tish Talk. Today, I have an incredible guest who has an unbelievable knowledge of history, Matthew Ehret. I came across him when I watched him on a podcast, and I was just overwhelmed with his knowledge. I mean, he's a deep knowledge of the real history. He's the editor-in-chief for the Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He wrote a book. He's written several books. One of them I bought, which is The Untold History of Canada, The Forgotten Struggle for Progress. Here it is. If anyone wants to access this, it's a thin book, but fascinating. I've just started that. We'll talk about that. He's also written the Clash of Two Americas trilogy, and he co-founded the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. So welcome, Matthew. Great to have you on the show today. How are you?
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tish.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Now, I know we could go, there's so many topics. I thought since a largely Canadian audience here, let's talk about maybe what got you into this level of research for history? I mean, what was the original inspiration for you and also for your wife, I guess?
Well, I think originally, especially in regards to that series of books that you're mentioning, the Untold History of Canada series, it was really just try to place Canada within a story that I was beginning to make sense of, but didn't really involve a coherent place for Canada. And I had personally come to my decision to break out of my mainstream identity when I had done a little bit of work. I was on a group team for university. We were working on a documentary, and I was looking into some material on 9/11 as part of my component or my contribution. And obviously, when you start like just downloading some alternative analysis on the topic, I found that there were very cogent points and very strong arguments that were being shown to me that I didn't think possible, that something within the U.S. government itself was more to blame for that event that killed thousands of people and then led to a complete transformation of the entire world system, an unleashing of a new age of regime change. A surveillance state really grew out of that. A bioterror apparatus grew out of that because there was also anthrax as another inside job.
Right.
Just a week later, right, in September 18th is when the anthrax attacks were launched, all to justify a multi-billion-dollar global bioterror apparatus run by the Pentagon. So, this is something which it really bugs me a lot. And it created I think ultimately a healthy form of obsession to try to get at, well, what is really the bigger picture? Because this didn't happen overnight. It's not like our government just became that corrupt in a couple of years such that something could have done that. I was like, this must have a longer continuity. So, you read more, you'll watch more documentaries, more lectures. And I had a tendency of trying to read what people with wisdom or people who I found had wisdom. If I'm like, okay, you've written a book or you've read this and you say that these books are good, I took note and I went out of my way to go to the library, order the book. So I tried to read a lot to replicate in my mind what steps their minds took in their pursuit of wisdom. And so that helped a lot as a good instinct, I think. And overall, it doesn't take long before you realize, no, there's a banking conspiracy. It's multi-generational. It involves completely reviewing all of history, both modern history from the American Revolution to the present, but also deeper history too, right? What was the Renaissance? What about the medieval ages? What caused the Dark Ages, right? What about the ancient world? Why did civilizations collapse? Why did Rome collapse? Why did ancient Greece collapse? What's going on in Egypt? So, you realize everything is a pattern that is interconnected. And the only reason why people can't see it is because there has been a controlled framing of a bad method that has been encouraged in the victims of those who will be controlled by a master class. And that technique of bad thinking, I guess you could say, that's encouraged in any system of empire is that you have to believe that your mind doesn't actually make discoveries. All you do is you memorize things that are commonly accepted beliefs, and they're justified by the authority of some consensus of experts that have all come to an agreement of X, Y, or Z, whether in history, whether in science, whether in whatever, and that becomes the substitute to your actual thinking that you use to memorize, to pass tests, right? To sound good, to sound smart, to get peer reviewed, to get published, to get a job, to keep your
Right.
job. And
Right.
then that's sort of the control system.
Well, look
And
at the Rockefeller medical system, how successful they were in completely replacing the whole holistic care, and discrediting any so-called natural remedy doctors, making them seem like they quacks and replacing it with these toxic drugs. And then
perfect.
doctors, it's really hard to break through to them now because they've memorized everything about prescription drugs, but nothing about nutrition. I think in university, they spend an hour or two on nutrition. The rest is covering all the prescription drugs. I mean, that's an example. Unbelievable how they've been able to infiltrate our minds. And it's all just memorization.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
one's thinking about whether this is actually true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I recently hosted, a friend of mine is a leader in the homeopathic movement in the United States, Kimalaya, and he gave a presentation to a group, a meeting that I host every week. And he was just going through the history of homeopathy, and how, this was a very, very big thing in the 19th century. And it was really subverted by the Rockefeller, the Carnegie Foundation investments into taking control of all medical science and health science. But if you look at it, like the Western medicine, as they say, is pretty good for like kinetic, you crush your ribs in a car accident,
Yeah.
things like that. It's
Yeah.
pretty good for that sort of thing. But as far as like diagnostics of causality, like actual causes of problems,
Root
terrible,
cause.
terrible.
Absolutely. So let's dive into
Yeah,
your
sure.
book. I mean, let's talk about Canada first, because honestly, I've only got through the first chapter or so, but it's already so fascinating. Can you give the audience, like a lot of people really are, we know the basics about Canadian history, but the subversion, maybe just start by talking about a central figure, Diefenbaker, because a lot of people in the freedom movement are even debating about the Bill of Rights versus our Constitution, and can you discuss that as well?
Sure,
Like,
yeah.
Diefenbaker is a central figure. I mean, he obviously was a good guy, had good intentions, kind of fell flat.
Yeah.
And then people are really, there's a lot of fights even about the Bill of Rights versus, whether we should use our Charter of Rights and Freedoms to defend our rights. What's your thoughts on this? It's a big topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, my investigation of Diefenbaker originally, I personally did not have, going into this, a very positive view of Diefenbaker as somebody who, I'd watched a lot of slander pieces, attack pieces, propaganda that had been put forth through the CBC and other things to, showcase Diefenbaker's overseeing of the destruction of the Avro Arrow hypersonic jets, for example.
Yes.
There's a lot of that sort of thing. And so, I didn't really think too much about him, but I didn't have a positive view. And it was only when I started looking into the fight for progress, like what was it that over the course of especially the 20th century, but also the 19th century, what caused the leaps towards progress, the creation of abundance, more freedoms? Because I can't say that today we have, in some ways yes, in some ways no. But I can't say that there was no increase of freedom or quality of life. You go back to Montreal in 1901, the average life expectancy was about 43 years of age. Today, it's about 77 for men, although that's going down thanks for certain things that we've been doing for the past 2 years. But despite that, there has been a tendency towards improvement on a variety of levels. You had to work, 12 to 13-hour days. There was no labor laws. If you were a 12-year-old kid, you'd still be expected to work unless you were rich. Back in the 19th century, by and large, literacy was much lower. So there are these metrics that demonstrate improvement. So I was like, well, was it that the oligarchy, which controls Canada, because we must not forget that Canada is still a monarchy controlled by a governor general, at a privy council and lieutenant governors and a whole body of deputy ministers run from the prime minister's office that are not elected. They're part of an embedded deep state civil service that is transgenerational. So it's like, that's not really a democracy, first of all. There's something else going on. We have democratic components. Right. We got this other thing too. Now, I was asking to myself, well, is it the case that this oligarchy just gave us these progresses, these leaps towards improvement, or were they fought for? And knowing a little thing about, I've never seen many examples in history of an oligarchy just wanting to provide honest emancipation to their slaves.
No.
So there was probably a fight. And so that got me looking into things like the fight that Diefenbaker had for progress, especially around the idea of opening up the Arctic to his northern vision, and how that was really in alignment with even his enemies in the Liberal Party of the day. It was a very different Liberal Party in the 1940s and 50s than today's Liberal Party. Back then, you had people like C.D. Howe, the Minister of Everything. You know, you had O.D. Skelton, you had Chubby Powers, you had William Lyon Mackenzie King was a bit of a mixed bag, but overall not a bad guy. But you had actual people who loved progress. They wanted to provide for improving the quality of life of the citizens of Canada. And they didn't see Canada as being just a plaything or a chess piece within a grand evil design. They didn't see it that way. So Diefenbaker, even though he had political enemies, it was a much healthier type of opposition back then than we have today, where today they debate about, you know, language, French, English, or transgender, but they don't actually talk about real ideas that pertain to the uplifting of quality of life of people.
Values. It's all ideologies.
It's ideologies, it's surface crap, it's distraction, but it's not real. It's not real. Whereas, back then they were talking about, well, what's the best way to actually improve the lives of Canadians? So Diefenbaker comes in at a certain point in 57. He gets a majority government in 58. And he starts he's the only populist prime minister, that I think ever really took power in the 20th century. His voting base was primarily Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta. BC at the time was not so goofball liberal. It still had a productive, more conservative-minded population. So it was a West Coast-based mass populist movement. He did not have the support of either the metropolitan centers of Toronto or Montreal, which is where the elite tend to, you know, control and
gather,
make choices of who's going to be in power. It's usually these zones. He bypassed that.
Oh, good.
But he didn't understand fully the Privy Council office either. So he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. He was a devout monarchist, which created big blind spots because he believed in British imperial propaganda about the grandeur and greatness of the British Empire, you know, and they'll always say that's the reason why Africa has anything good or India has anything good is because the British were there giving them good things, you know? And he believed all of that romanticism as a dummy. And so he misstepped. He started taking bad advice. But despite that, he did work very hard to create hydroelectric dams, to open up the Arctic, to fight against the Malthusian Rhodes Scholars who had embedded themselves in his own cabinet, like Davy Fulton. There were a variety of Rhodes Scholars from Oxford who are part of this apparatus keeping Canada backwards. Kind of like Chrystia Freeland is not a new thing. Bob Rae is not a new thing. They are modern Rhodes Scholars. Joe Biden has like 8 of them circling around his immediate environment. You know, Susan Rice, Jake Sullivan, Eric Lander is now out, but he was the science czar for a year and a half. There's a lot of these Rhodes Scholars placed in positions of influence.
They'd be like the World Economic Forum equivalent for people who are familiar with the Rhodes Scholars. Just as the
World Economic Forum, like Young Leader program, for example, is kind of like a junior imitation of the older Rhodes Scholar system, which is much more, it's higher up in the chain of command. So the Young Leader movement is like just lower level managers. The Rhodes Scholar system is higher level managers, but they're all just managers deployed and used like tools, not in control of their own destiny, really.